Hello and welcome to Politics at Jack and Sam's Daily, which brings you up to speed with everything you need to know about British politics in the day ahead.
It is Tuesday, October the 1st, and Sam, that means today is the 1 year anniversary of the day we started this podcast. Happy birthday, Sam. Can you believe we've been doing it for a whole year? Started off with a sort of, let's hook up on a Sunday afternoon and maybe have a glass of wine and talk about politics for half an hour, won't take long, and has morphed into this hideous beast where I have to see you every morning on Zoom at 6:30 in the morning. What are we doing, man?
It's an absolute pleasure, but I think we're here because it seems like there are quite a lot of people listening, certainly judging by what people have been saying here in Birmingham and in Liverpool and in Brighton. So thank you for listening, and so long as you are, we'll keep going. We are in Birmingham for Conservative Party conference. Sort of 24 hours on, we were talking about the buoyancy and the kind of, everyone being quite chipper. As they try and fill the endless hours, and it did feel like yesterday, particularly those interviews on the stage, were quite long. I'm just detecting it's starting to get a bit more scratchy, Jack.
What do you mean by scratchy? You mean grumpy?
Grumpy.
Bit fighty?
Yeah, and with people working for the campaigns just willing to be a bit more disobliging about their rivals, people's enthusiasm for opposition just starting to look like it's dawning on them that it's going to be a long road back. Just less optimism around than there was at the start when they arrived.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. People get a little bit tired and a little bit more hungover, don't they, after they've been here for a couple of days. We are on to day 3 now. Tomorrow is the final day of this conference. The other thing that strikes me, Sam, is that there's just a lot of people here who've recently lost their jobs. It's kind of an obvious point, but when you think about it, you go around a lot of the parties, the receptions, or you just chat to people around the conference. There are former SPADs, there are former MPs, there are loads of former MPs. Apparently they got free tickets. We counted up about 40 we saw yesterday. And all these people are looking for jobs. They're angling for jobs in consultancies, or they're trying to do something back in the private sector and they're struggling. We heard Jonathan Gullis saying he was applying for jobs as a teacher, the former Tory MP, and wasn't getting anywhere. And other people, I've had people with their head in their hands talking to me saying, I just don't know what to do with my life now, Jack, after a defeat like that, and I'm out of politics. Do I leave? And so there's a sort of sense of people going round, almost angling for work, which gives it a slightly desperate feel sometimes at Tory conference. I've never really been to one where that's been happening before.
No, an Oscar award for Jonathan Gullis, who's putting the performance of his life to get employment, as he would put it, anywhere, in a school, in a consultancy, as a media performer. So if you have a job for Jonathan Gullis, please do get in contact. No, not with us, just with Jonathan Gullis.
Anyway, just let me tell you one more interesting person seeking a job. Already, Grant Shapps, the former cabinet minister, is very much looking for a job as a Tory MP. He seems to think that a seat is going to become vacant pretty soon, not too far from him, and he's got his eye on making an immediate return. He, of course, lost his seat in the election like many other Tory MPs. And interestingly, Sam, he's launching a new group today called Conservatives Together, which may sound familiar to people who've been monitoring the group Labour Together, which was the sort of vehicle set up during the Jeremy Corbyn years by Morgan McSweeney and others, and that ultimately became the vehicle for taking the party back to the centre and the vehicle for getting Keir Starmer in power. So Grant Shapps very much trying to make himself a Tory power player once again. He's been wandering around conference with the inevitable Shapps spreadsheet, and fancies his next job might actually be as a Tory MP again.
I hope he gives me a call to give me more details. Now, look, there's a lot going on here, but the global focus is the Middle East again. At 2 a.m. local time, Israel sent ground troops supported by artillery into southern Lebanon in what the Israeli military described as a limited, localised operation against Hezbollah.
Yeah, and this is obviously a breach of the call by Britain, by America, by France, by all those other allies not to escalate this conflict any further. Israel is ignoring that and just carrying on with a further incursion. And of course, this has now prompted a massive scramble, Sam, to evacuate the remaining UK citizens. And there's thought to be thousands of them there out of the country. So this is going to be a big operation, right, for the British government to try and deal with now.
It's not a huge focus of our coverage at the moment, but there is a lot of UK activity. David Lammy was chairing Cobra yesterday. That was largely focused on the efforts to get citizens out, and they're working with commercial airlines to increase capacity, and they're looking at whether or not they might need to charter special flights back to the UK. There is a rapid deployment team to support Brits at the Beirut airport. There are already 700 British troops in Cyprus. And of course, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary are talking to their counterparts, not least American counterparts. You had Antony Blinken speaking to David Lammy yesterday. You know, we had that big call for a ceasefire when Keir Starmer was at the UN last week, alongside the US, France and other countries. They are simply renewing that call today, but it fell on deaf ears over the weekend, and it doesn't sound like Israel is heeding that. So we wait to see the nature of the escalation of what's going on in the Middle East. But that is not the subject, not the focus of where we're going to take you today. We will no doubt come back to it in the coming days, but we are going to focus much more on what's immediate here in Birmingham. To start with, Jack, what are our three things today?
Well, I think the most interesting thing here today is a Sky News poll of Tory members, which is you guys have very kindly published in the last few minutes, and tells us finally what is actually going on with the people who really matter in this leadership contest, i.e. the Conservative Party members who are actually going to decide who the next leader is. And that is the insight we've all been waiting for. There's been so much speculation here, Sam, about, oh, well, maybe Kemi Badenoch is still really popular with the Tory members, and then other camps will tell you, oh, well, nobody really knows what the Tory members think. Well, it seems to me that a poll of Tory members by Sky News is exactly what we needed. So let's start off by talking about that. Well, I want to talk about Simon Case as well before we finish, because, of course, a change in Cabinet Secretary is a massive deal back in Whitehall. But let's start with the poll. Why don't you talk us through the headline findings, Sam, about what Tory members actually think about this leadership race?
Now, what we've got for you is the first YouGov poll of Tory members, about 800 of them, that was conducted up to Sunday night, just over a week. Now, this is the first poll that they've done since there were 4 candidates, and it's the first poll of Tory members that's happened really since the kind of middle of August. So it's the first snapshot in 6 weeks. And the important thing that you can see from space is that the Tory membership have moved. And they've moved in that all-important question of what would happen if the two people who are currently getting the most support from Tory MPs and therefore currently more likely than the others to be in the final ballot, Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick, face off against each other. And what has happened? 6 weeks ago, Badenoch was in front by a mile. 6 weeks ago, she was winning 59% to Robert Jenrick's 41%, an 18-point lead for her. Now, in our poll today, basically Robert Jenrick has surged and shrunk that gap really to not very much. So today, it's 52% to Kemi Badenoch and 48% to Robert Jenrick. So we've gone down from an 18-point lead to a 4-point lead in 6 weeks. So you can see the membership becoming more attracted to the Jenrick campaign. Jenrick, of course, currently has the most support from Tory MPs, with Kemi Badenoch coming in second. And the question is, does this give him just the necessary amount of momentum to make him feel a bit unstoppable? But there's a bigger conclusion of the poll, which is really, if you look at the margins, it is too close to call what's going to happen. Because say Kemi Badenoch doesn't make the final round and it's the next placed Tory MP, James Cleverly. Well, again, he has closed the gap and he is within touching distance of Robert Jenrick. So if it's a Jenrick-Cleverly final round, then that is 52% for Jenrick, 48% for Cleverly. In other words, there is a chance that we could end up with a One Nation Conservatives winning this contest as well. Tom Tugendhat is trailing quite a lot in this poll, but it seems to me like Robert Jenrick and James Cleverly are the big winners, and Kemi Badenoch seems to have lost her convincing advantage, although she is still a bit ahead.
It's so interesting, and it really does show, Sam, that to coin a football cliche, there really is everything to play for here. It means the things that are being played out on the stage here today and tomorrow, and the way the campaign goes then over the next few weeks, especially once it gets whittled down to 2, really, really matters, because all of these results are so close. It's almost like everything in politics always has to be this 52-48% ratio, doesn't it, all the way back to Brexit, and here it is again rearing its ugly head, and that is just too close to call. That means only a small number of people moving in the other direction and you get to, a change of result, and I guess a lot of Tory members went into this contest as big fans of Kemi Badenoch. She was seen to do very well in the 2022 contest. She was regularly topping the sort of members' polls on Conservative Home's website about who is your favourite leadership contender long before this contest was actually launched. And so probably quite a lot of Tory members went into this with a preconceived idea that she was their favourite. And what's happened over the last few weeks and months is they've really engaged with this. Robert Jenrick's emerged as a new option, and they're starting to take a look at him, and indeed at James Cleverly, it seems, and going, oh, actually, I quite like this guy. I'm quite interested in him being leader instead. And so, as you say, the momentum very much with them, and it looks like bad news for Kemi Badenoch, and what frankly feels like it's been quite a bad week for Kemi Badenoch, given that so much of the contest conversation here has been dominated by controversial comments she's made, or comments that were deemed controversial anyway. And even though I would say, I was watching her on stage yesterday, I thought she gave a pretty compelling performance in terms of, lots of interesting answers to questions, which isn't always the case with politicians. It doesn't feel like she's having a good week in terms of the coverage she's getting, and clearly this poll is not good news for her either. Shall we just talk about, Sam, what's actually coming up today, so that people know what they can expect to see, because it is Robert Jenrick's turn to take the stage this afternoon. He will be doing the same format that we saw from Kemi Badenoch yesterday. He'll be on stage at 2:00 with GB News' Chris Hope for a Q&A session for an hour, and that will be followed at 3:00 by James Cleverly doing that. So they sort of get their turn in the sun today. However, Kemi Badenoch is doing a sit-down in-conversation interview with Fraser Nelson of The Spectator on a different stage. That will be pretty interesting to watch. She, of course, used to work at The Spectator back in the day. And Tom Tugendhat is running around doing all sorts of other events as well. I think he's doing at least 2 in-conversation events himself. So we'll see loads more of them today, and they will all be scrambling to try and sort of, I guess, grab a headline in a positive way, because they're all now looking for a way that they can change the game a little bit.
You say grab a headline in a positive way. I have to say, I am really struck, whether it's the public pronouncements or the private briefings, just how this contest is sliding into a bit of a sort of nasty party contest. Now, you remember that phrase that Theresa May coined back when she was chairman of the Conservative Party over 20 years ago. She called, when the party was in opposition, the Tories the nasty party. Now, fast forward to 2024, and I think that there is a concern, particularly amongst One Nation MPs, that the kinds of pronouncements that we're hearing are radical, sure, perhaps even necessary, but really quite off-putting to voters. So we had the squall around Kemi Badenoch's maternity comments yesterday. Well, she seemed to double down at one stage on the stage, also seeming to suggest that a local cafe in her constituency closed down, blaming in part the minimum wage. And I'm quite struck the FT put this on their front page, and I'm even more struck that one of the campaigns was waving the front page of the FT in my face after 11 o'clock last night, enthusiastically saying that they thought that the Kemi campaign was in a spiral. Whether or not those kinds of pronouncements are starting to cast a shadow on the Tory party. Adjacent to that, you've got Robert Jenrick's extraordinary claim yesterday that UK special forces were killing rather than capturing terrorists, because our lawyers tell us that if they're caught, the European court will set them free, which has outraged people in the serving military, just saying that's not true, and calling it an outrageous accusation. I think this whole conversation about whether or not that there is a nasty tinge to the Tory party all of a sudden came home for me when I was talking to, in the space of an hour, 2 different Muslim members of the Conservative Party, both of whom were expressing a howl of kind of pain at the direction of the party, whether it was Robert Jenrick's Alu Akbar comment, he said that anyone who said that should be immediately arrested during the Gaza ceasefire protests, whether it's Kemi Badenoch suggesting some cultures are better than others. There's one activist just from one of the local parties was going, how can we end up in a situation where this party is literally saying it doesn't represent me, but didn't want to go public with their thoughts? And I think whether it's alienating parts of the community that are struggling, or mothers, or entire communities such as the Muslim community, whilst I'm not saying that they've gone all the way down that path, it does feel to me that there is a risk now that in the free-for-all and attention-grabbing phase of this leadership contest, some real damage and hurt can be done, even more damage and hurt can be done to the Tory brand in this period.
Although, of course, that does mean that people out there in the real world have to actually be noticing that any of this is happening. And I was struck watching one of the main news bulletins last night how there was basically no coverage of this entire conference happening at all.
Although I suspect the Labour Party are watching very carefully, and if it doesn't get recycled now, then it will do much closer to an election.
Yeah, I dare say you're right. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what's happening back in Whitehall while we're all here having a chat and drinks and briefings, and indeed plenty of unpleasant briefings in Birmingham, which is the departure of Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, was announced yesterday, the most important civil servant in the land. This was not unexpected. He really is very ill and has got a neurological condition, so we knew this was coming. It is also quite useful timing for Keir Starmer, because Simon Case is not well liked and not particularly trusted by the current Downing Street operation. They inherited Simon Case from the previous operation. He was brought in by Boris Johnson originally. Simon Case is an operator. You know, he is a cabinet secretary, the like of which we haven't really seen before. He's a much younger man than normally does the job. He hadn't run a government department like people normally do it before.
He's our age, Jack. That's how young he is.
Good grief, he's as young as us, a mere whippersnapper. But he was always described to me as a courtier. People, he was really smart, and he is really smart, capable, intelligent, all that stuff, but also played the game. He would brief, he would meet with journalists, he would brief against his bosses. We saw those WhatsApp messages during the COVID inquiry, incredibly indiscreet messages about people working all around him, including the Prime Minister, not the sort of thing you would have expected a Cabinet Secretary to be doing. I always remember someone who worked very closely with him. I asked them, what do you think of Simon Case? They said, I like Simon, but he's a snake, Jack. He's a snake, just to be clear. Again, not the sort of thing you'd expect to hear about the sort of most senior civil servant. So Simon Case is on his way, and that means the firing gun has been started yesterday to replace him, and that is going to be a really interesting race for us to watch over the next few weeks, because, of course, whoever wins that race and gets the job, and the job ad is on the government website now at £200,000 a year if you fancy it, is going to play an absolutely key role at the heart of Keir Starmer's Downing Street and trying to sort out that Downing Street operation, which, as we've said on this podcast several times, Sam, is obviously not operating very well at all at the moment.
That's right. If you look at the runners and riders to replace Simon Case, I think, and they're trying to do this really quickly. They're basically giving themselves October and then a decision in early November, for what I can tell from the press release. There are problems with all of the kind of, the supposed front runners in this race. So, rattling around the civil service, there are three names that come up. One is Melanie Dawes, head of Ofcom. One is Antonio Romeo, and one is Ollie Robbins, who was the sort of civil servant in charge of the Brexit process in Theresa May's days. So Melanie Dawes has done a number of high-profile roles around Whitehall, including running Ofcom. Ofcom is hardly the least controversial body in government. It's had the very, very tricky job of regulating broadcasters and overseeing the birth of things like GB News, which is obviously highly contentious in Labour circles. So you can see some of those decisions coming back to be, and her being asked about that. Antonio Romeo was denied the job of permanent secretary in the Treasury during the Liz Truss years. So if you're not good enough to run the Treasury, can you be good enough to run the entire civil service? Ollie Robbins was the figure of intense political briefing because of his role during the Brexit years. there could be concerns that he's just too high profile a figure, but he has been out of government, working for a consultancy, and we will see whether he ends up with that job or maybe the job of National Security Advisor.
Yeah, Oliver Robbins very much seen as Sue Gray's choice, the Chief of Staff, known to be close to Sue Gray, and they speak a lot, we know that. But is Sue Gray the powerful figure she once was? Is Sue Gray going to really be the person picking the Cabinet Secretary, giving all the briefing against her and questions about how long she's going to last in her job? It doesn't feel like it. The three that you've named are three very high-profile people in Westminster circles. They all are big characters in their own right, and I do wonder, given how this Downing Street operation has kicked things off, given how badly it's gone, frankly, for Keir Starmer over the summer, does he really want a big, high-profile Cabinet Secretary with their own character and their own backstory and someone else that the press is going to turn into a big character, just as has happened with his Chief of Staff and his top advisor? I think not. I think you'd be much wiser to bring in one of the current permanent secretaries who nobody's ever heard of, like Tamara Finkelstein at DevFur, or Sarah Healy from HCLG, or Jeremy Pocklington, or one of those other, like, very low-profile Sir Humphrey-type figures that no one's ever heard of, who won't become yet another story and yet another psychodrama, frankly, for people like you and me to talk about on this podcast.
That's a great cliffhanger on which to stop it, because we've got over 20 minutes. Let's end it there. We'll be back for the final day of Conservative Party conference in Birmingham tomorrow. See you then.
One more day. See you there. Cheers.